the end of last year, Nisi introduced their new True Colour ND Vario Pro-nano 1:5 stop variable neutral density filter. That's quite a mouthful, but basically what it is, it's a new variable neutral density filter from Nisi, which is essentially true color in the sense that there is almost zero color cast. In fact, there is basically zero color cast to the actual image when you're shooting with it. The new filter, which comes in a new little canvas bag, which works quite nicely. It certainly looks nicer than the old straight plastic box that it used to come in. You still get the box, incidentally. The new filter, which comes in a nice canvas bag, has a couple of improvements over the older enhanced Vario-ND filter. So first off, you'll notice when you first unbox it is that it has a much larger knurled ring, which makes it somewhat easier to install or remove from the front of your camera lens. The second thing that you're probably going to notice is that unlike the older Vario-ND filter, which only had little dots to mark the rough sort of the density that you were getting at, this actually has the stop marks marked as 1:5 stop marks. And of course, that means that there is an additional half stop of light reduction compared to the older enhanced Vario-ND. So on those points, that is quite a significant upgrade from the older filter. Something else that a lot of photographers will appreciate is the fact that the little prong that can be used to turn the actual filter itself can be removed. Now on the older filter, you couldn't remove it. Some photographers didn't like that, other photographers liked it, so now you actually have your choice. You can remove it or not. I personally prefer the prong. I find it much easier to adjust the filter on the fly if I have it attached. Then finally, it also comes with a filter cap. Now the filter cap is great. It means that you can actually pop the filter cap on the filter while it's attached to the camera and then stow the camera in your bag, rather than having to remove the filter first before you put a lens cap. If there is one criticism I have about the filter cap, is that it only really works properly when you remove the prong. Otherwise, if you have the prong attached, you will notice, unfortunately, that the filter cap doesn't sit flush on it. Still works, just not as effective. So if there's one minor criticism, it's that. That's not a deal breaker. It's a bit of a nothingness, really. The headline item, though, is the fact that this filter, with the help of Japanese optical engineers that were involved in the design of the filter has managed to reduce any color cast to it. Some critics and people who have done proper benchmark testing on it have discovered that essentially this is the most neutral density or color neutral density available on the market. It's a groundbreaking piece of glass if you are wanting proper accurate color when you're shooting video or stills with neutral densities attached to your camera. Although it might be true color in the sense that there is no color cast exhibited in the images, it is still a polarizer. So the polarizer is going to have an effect on reflective surfaces. It's going to make certain colors look deeper without that reflective glisten that comes off of them. You'll see this in glass, for instance, and you'll potentially see it if you're photographing foliage. Now, according to who you talk to, variable neutral densities have something of a bad rap amongst photographers, and this is due to the early iterations of these filters that came out. Now, the way that a neutral density filter works is essentially it is a polarizer with additional neutral density film attached to it. Now, it's not just one polarizer, it's two polarizers. If you consider how a polarizer works, it's essentially like a Venetian blind. And as you turn it, it changes the way or the wavelength of light that comes through the lens itself. So essentially darkening or blocking a particular wavelength of light. If you take two filters and you put them in front of each other, two Venetian blinds, you get full light pass when the Venetian blinds are aligned. As you turn the one, what you're doing is you're blocking another wavelength of light. And essentially, what happens is that you are darkening your photograph, or you're darkening or reducing the amount of light that can pass through the lens onto the sensor. The issue that early neutral density filters had, or the early variable neutral density filters had, is that there was no stop mark. So you could end up over-polarizing, and you would get an effect called the X-effect, which was dark corners or dark lines that look a little bit like an X inside your photograph. Nisi, even with their earlier models of this particular filter, put a hard stop on the filter. You can actually hear it when I do this. Meaning that you cannot over polarize, so you don't get the X effect. So that's done away with. That's no longer an issue. The other bad rap issue that people came across is the fact that if you're doing long exposure still photography on a wide angle lens, you're going to end up potentially with a darker side to the photograph or a darker corner. Now this is because it's a polarizer. If you use a wide angle lens and you are shooting at right angles to the sun, essentially only a portion of the sky is going to be polarized effectively, leaving one side of the photograph slightly darker. It's just something you have to work with. But it does mean that this doesn't necessarily replace a full set of solid neutral density filters that you would use with stills photography. The real reason that these filters exist is not for stills photographers though, it is for videographers. Now, advanced videographers will know this as a matter of course, but people starting out in videography or stills photographers aren't aware of the fact necessarily that your shutter speed, or what they call shutter angle in videography, has to be half the actual frame rate. Now, DSLRs and video cameras tend to shoot at around 30 frames per second, or 30p. That's the fast rate. If you're wanting to shoot in the more sort of filmic look, you tend to shoot at 24 or 25p. Now that means that the shutter speed that you're working with tends to be 1/50th of a second to 1/60th of a second. Anything faster and any movement inside the frame is going to jitter. It's going to look overly sharp and it's not going to look natural to the eye. So to be able to get fluid movement, you always have to maintain a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, or half of the frame rate. That's great if you're shooting at 120p, because then it's possible to shoot at 250th of a second, or 60p even, which allows 125th of a second. But if you're shooting at the standard 30p, it means that you have to have a minimum shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. You can go slower, but obviously then you're going to have other issues. So 1/60th of a second is the benchmark. That's what we're looking at. Now, if you're trying to adjust your exposure, you can either use your ISO and you can lower it, or you can use your aperture and you can make it smaller. So using something like f/18. The problem, of course, is what happens if you're wanting to use a longer lens with a creamier bokeh in the background, like a talking headshot, or if you're just wanting to be able to use less depth of field for an artistic effect. Without the filter, you are forced to use a smaller aperture or a lower ISO, but our cameras don't necessarily shoot at ISO 12. So this filter is an essential filter for DSLR video makers, because it's the only way to effectively reduce the amount of light coming through the lens so that you have more creative control over your aperture when you are shooting. Now, dedicated video cameras like the Canon C100 and even cheaper entry-level camcorders, they have built-in neutral density filters, so you don't need to worry about one of these. You just click a button and it slots into place in front of the sensor. So if you're shooting DSLR or even one of the mirrorless cameras, this is now a necessary requirement if you're wanting to do more, or if you want to have more control over your video exposure. Now, the main criteria when you are buying a filter or a variable neutral density filter is going to be, one, ease of use. The new True Colour Vario-ND is great because of the knurled filter marks, or the knurled body, which allows you to remove and install it far more easily. I particularly like the fact that you can remove the prong, makes it nice and easy. It has an additional half stop, which is fantastic compared to the older filters. It allows a longer period of time that you're able to shoot, which makes a big difference if you're out in the field. The second most core principle that you're going to have to look at when you are considering a variable neutral density filter is the fact of whether it's going to exhibit the X effect or not. This ruins any photograph if you have a filter that over-polarizes and you end up with those X marks on the edges of your frame. The variable neutral densities from Nisi managed to negate that because they have introduced the hard stop on their filters. So make sure you look for a hard stop on any variable neutral density filter that you're going to consider purchasing. And then, to me, the most important reason why you would consider a variable neutral density is the color cast. Now, some people might say, it doesn't matter, I can color grade this in post at a later stage. It's a bad excuse. Essentially, if you can start with good optically neutral or color neutral footage at the very beginning, it reduces the amount of time that you're going to have to be doing any post-production work. So a neutral density filter that is properly optically and color neutral is essential if you're going to be doing high-end video work. Now, as I've mentioned, the filter is more for videographers than for still photographers. That doesn't mean that you can't use it for stills photography, and I've used it quite successfully. It's very useful having a filter that allows you to change on the fly this quickly. It does not replace a full set of square filters like the V7 with the 3, 6, and 10 stop and graduated neutral density filters. One of the issues, of course, is that you cannot accurately mount a graduated neutral density filter onto the front of one of these filters. For the start, that it rotates. If you are a filmmaker, you would use something like this in a matte box, which allows independent mounting of a variable neutral density and a graduated neutral density. But for stills photography, the best answer is still to use either a full square system or to use dedicated circular filters, which actually a 3, 6, and 10 dedicated neutral density filter costs essentially the same as buying one of these. If you are going to be doing any videography, I would highly recommend buying one of these filters. If you are doing only stills photography and you don't do any filmmaking at all, then rather go for one of the square filter systems or a circular filter that has a neutral density film attached rather than the variable neutral density. It's just optically easier to work with, and you don't need to worry about the fact that you might end up with unevenly polarized skies that basically affect your exposure. I couldn't find any color cast shooting stills either, even with long exposure. So this is as neutral as you're going to get. And other critics on the internet who have actually done benchmark testing with spectrometers have found the same, that this is essentially a color neutral filter, which is fantastic. If you enjoyed the video and you found it interesting, please think about popping a like in the corner and subscribing to the channel. I will be doing more videos in future around filter use, variable neutral density filters, the V7 as well. I am a Nisi ambassador, so I'd also run workshops when it comes around to filters, and you can probably follow along in some of the videos on that. If you'd like to know some more about the filters themselves, you're more than welcome to drop an email at emil@natureslight.co.za. I'm happy to answer questions. You can purchase the filters from the distributor in South Africa, Landscape Gear, from myself and Nature's Light, as well as from several other outlets in South Africa that distribute the Nisi filters. As I've mentioned before, if you are shooting video, get one of these. You won't regret it. Cheers.